Hey everybody, welcome back to our video. So today I want to talk about Theodore Roszak's book, The Making of a Counterculture. This is a book that I've wanted to read for quite a while. There's definitely a lot of things in this book that I agree with, things I disagree with, but overall it's a very interesting read. I think it says a lot about American counterculture. And this book was published in 1969. And I feel like 1969 is really one of the key years in American counterculture. That's really the year where things, I think, reached their peak, but also began to really fizzle out and burn itself out. And this book here is where the term counterculture was coined. So the fact that counterculture is being coined as a term in 1969 really says a lot about what was happening in the world at that time. I think that really points to 1969 being a very significant year in the development of American counterculture. So this book, it says a lot about counterculture, but I think it also says a lot just the fact of the time period that this book was written in. It's very reflective of what was going on in the world at that time. So it's a very interesting book, a lot of things to say about it. I'm not going to go over every single thing in this book. There's a ton of information in here, but I'm going to kind of pull out the main things that I found interesting, helpful to me, and just kind of talk about a couple ideas that I found very interesting in this book. But the main core idea in this book is the concept of a technocracy. And a technocracy is kind of this subliminal totalitarianism that arises when society's commitment to this scientific worldview, as he describes it, people are committed to this industrial affluence that's going on in the world, and through that commitment, a lot of people who control technologies are able to control society. And I don't personally feel that a technocracy is really the best way to describe the state of society in the year 1969. I mean, this is the era of the Cold War, of the military-industrial complex. So I really see where he's coming from. I understand why he's arguing that technology controls society, but I think in the 50s and 60s, and even still today, I think corporate interests are really what drive society. And with these corporate interests, I think the term inverted totalitarianism is a much more fitting description of what he's trying to describe than a technocracy. But I think the idea of a technocracy is much more relevant today than it was in the year 1969, because today we have things like artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence, I think, is really a technology that can control us much more than any other technology that's come before. So I think I don't necessarily agree with what Roszak is saying in regards to 1969 and the era that this book was written, but I think today a lot of his ideas are much more relevant. But I like the way that he describes the state of democracy and the threat to democracy, because he talks about how, to kind of paraphrase him here, so that the threat from the democracy comes from undermanagement, not overmanagement. And a lot of libertarian ideas really promote this idea of lessening government control in people's lives for fear of, totalitarianism, fear of, government overreach. But I think those ideas really are what lead to totalitarianism and dictatorships, because when government's undermanaged, it allows for forces other than reason to shape society. It creates a very weak system where more powerful entities can come in and take control. Because I feel like most dictators that rose to power, people like Hitler or Stalin, they rose to power in a very weak democracy, a very weak government. So I think a lot of these libertarian ideas of less government control, they sound good in theory, but they really just create a weaker government, and it creates a society that can be exploited by a more powerful force, which in this book, the explanation is, a technocracy. A technology can really exploit society. And I really like in this book how he describes that a lot of the cultural ideals of the counterculture, a lot of these ideas were already enjoyed by the elite ruling class in America, or the technocracy, as he explains in this book. So a lot of the freedoms that the counterculture wanted to bring to society as a whole were already experienced by the elites in our society. So a lot of these ideas were nothing really new. They were just trying to bring these ideas to more people. And the first person to really explore these power structures in America was the sociologist C. Wright Mills, which is explained in this book. And in Mills' book, The Power Elite, which I read many, many years ago, he really paints a picture of this power structure, of this ruling elite class in America, But what I find interesting with these ideas is that C. Wright Mills, he was trying to promote these ideas to a lot of other academics, other powerful people in American society, but it really wasn't successful in changing the power structures in America. But where these ideas really caught on were students, not academics. The actual students in universities were the ones who really latched on to C. Wright Mills and all his ideas. So it really shows that a lot of change in America was coming from a much younger generation. The younger people were the ones who were really driving change in America and latching on to all these new ideas about power structures in American society. And I also really like in this book how he describes how the hippies and the counterculture were part of a much broader counterculture movement that included the New Left, because he calls the New Left this idea of class consciousness revolution, and the hippies were this consciousness revolution. People like Timothy Leary who were trying to change the way that consciousness worked with drugs like LSD. So when you look at, I think, the New Left and the hippies as this much broader movement happening in America, you really see that the 60s really this era of real upheaval of culture in America. And it's just interesting to look at the New Left and hippies as really, at a fundamental level, really trying to do the same thing just by changing the idea of consciousness in society. And Roszak is very critical of the idea of class consciousness in America. But as someone who's part of the New Left, he's more of I would say, a constructive critic of class consciousness. And one good way he describes this or explains this is through the civil rights movement. Because he talks about how the civil rights movement, their end goal really is to establish Black America as a prosperous middle class. And he kind of asks a question, if ultimately at the end of this revolution, Black America, establishes this prosperous middle class like we saw, with white America in the 1950s, will that ultimately lead to a lot of discontent among young people like you saw in the 60s? Like, will this prosperous middle class also have this youth rebellion like you saw in the 1960s? So it really makes you think about, we look at the end goal of where things are headed, will it ultimately, cycle back through the same process that led to, this era of upheaval and rebellion in the 1960s. But it's just a lot of interesting questions you don't really hear a lot in looking back at the civil rights movement and the class consciousness revolution. But yeah, just very interesting reflections. It just really makes you think about society. But I like how he describes that the counterculture or the consciousness as he describes it, they were very much for really just tearing down the system. The poet Allen Ginsberg, his poem Howl, which is really one of the watershed moments in the birth of counterculture in America. In that poem, it talks about burning money. So it's talking about just burning down the system. And that really, I think, highlights a very big contradiction in the broader consciousness revolution, because the civil rights movement is trying to make people, economically prosperous, but Allen Ginsberg is talking about just destroying and burning down capitalism. So you definitely see this rift in the broader consciousness revolution, where there's a lot of contradictions in what the end goals were. But he talks about how with counterculture, that in the 1960s, a lot of counterculture was starting to be very focused on symbols and style and imagery. And he talks about how those symbols and imagery really show how counterculture can become a fad, how it can become something that can burn out very quickly. Because when it starts becoming, stylistic and very focused on image, it very quickly starts to move away from being a counterculture. And I think he was very spot on with that, because I feel like when this book was written, 1969 is the year where, counterculture really started to become mainstream. And a lot of the symbolism and styles and imagery of the hippie revolution started to become pop culture. So I think he's really foreshadowing the death of counterculture in the way that it started to become very focused on imagery and symbols. And the part of this book that is really, I think, the real meat and potatoes of what he's trying to describe is chapter 3. In chapter 3, which is titled The Dialects of Liberation, talks about two figures, Herbert Marcuse and Norman Brown. And I had to keep going back and rereading portions of this chapter to really understand it, because it's very theoretical. A lot of information is thrown at you in this chapter, but I want to kind of break down the main ideas that he's trying to present in this chapter. And by looking at these two figures, Herbert Marcuse and Norman Brown, with Herbert Marcuse, he's looking at his ideas and really showing how he explains that society, represses people. And by looking at Norman Brown, he's talking about how a lot of repression comes from internally within people, how we repress ourselves. And Roszak is trying to explain that to have a successful counterculture, you need to overcome both these things. You need to overcome the ways that society represses us and how we repress ourselves. And he's really getting into a lot of Freudian ideas, a lot of Karl Marx, which I think this is really where the book starts to really date itself, because a lot of the ideas of Freud are not really accepted in mainstream society anymore. So it was a little weird reading about how he's looking at psychoanalysis to kind of explain how people repress themselves from the inside. But ultimately, I think what he's trying to describe is that, to really change society, you have to change both society and individual people. And to kind of paraphrase what describes in this book, basically, Norman Brown, he says that basically people are trained to feel guilty about their desires. And he talks about how, this Christian society in the 1950s really brainwashed people and made them, fearful of their desires. And with Herbert Marcuse, he kind of explains how society represses us because this technocracy needs obedient, efficient, consumption-driven people to work for this system. So he basically just explains how society controls people, and you need to overcome the way society controls people in order to have a successful counterculture. Basically, you need to overcome the technocracy to really change society. So after getting through chapter 3 and wrapping my head around everything that's explained in that chapter, he goes into looking a little more at just culture in America. And he uses Allen Ginsberg again as an example. He talks about how in Ginsberg's early writing, he's more talking about the apocalypse than revolution, which is what you think of when you think of counterculture. But by looking at the apocalypse and seeing this impending doom of civilization, he's talking about the destruction of the established order in America. And he compares this writing to the style of the saxophonist Charlie Parker with his bebop music, which is kind of just a lot of random notes and just kind of chaos in the music. And Jackson Pollock has his abstract expressionism form of art, where it's a lot of just splashes and random lines and messy work and just kind of just chaotic painting. And he talks about how that's very similar to Ginsberg talking about the apocalypse, where it's just complete destruction. He talks about how it's like speaking in tongues, just kind of speaking in this language that no one really understands, but at the same time, it's creating the language of the counterculture. It's creating a brand new language. That's what I've talked about before, that postmodern art is really the language of counterculture, and that's what the Beats and people like Jackson Pollock were really doing it in their art. But in this book, he kind of describes how it just represents the destruction of the established order that existed before World War II. And he talks a great deal about Gary Schneider and Alan Watts, who the two of them really were into Zen Buddhism and brought a lot of Zen Buddhist ideas into the counterculture. And talks about how there's a lot of criticism of them because a lot of their ideas aren't really true Zen. It's a lot of just borrowed ideas that they're interpreting in their own ways. But regardless, he talks about how the adoption of a lot of these Buddhist ideas and Eastern ideas represent a break from culture, represent finding something new, breaking away from this Christian nation that we had in the 1950s and just looking for something different. It's just creating a new culture and language in America. And this book, I feel, definitely starts to fall apart a little bit at the end. There's a lot more stuff that I disagree with as he starts talking about various things in his writing and trying to pool everything he talks about together. But one chapter in particular I really like, because I feel like it really highlights where counterculture was going, and that's the chapter where he talks about psychedelics. And he's very critical of Timothy Leary and psychedelic culture, because he describes that LSD use, people used LSD to try to find a new consciousness, create this consciousness revolution, but he describes that LSD really has the opposite effect. It really doesn't create this conscious revolution. But he talks about how addictive drugs are drugs that require continual use. And LSD is not an addictive drug in the sense that you need to keep taking it physically, but in the way that people use it, he describes it as being addictive because people who used it saw it as something that needed to be continually used again and again to continue to shape consciousness. And the fact that it requires continual use in that sense, he describes it as an addictive drug. And he just it says that anything that's addictive is not going to create this consciousness revolution. And drugs, they're something that were sold to people. So there's this entrepreneurial interest in selling drugs. And drugs kind of turned into this religion, and drugs were a symbol. Because he talks early in this book about how symbols are a very bad sign when it comes to a counterculture. It shows that it's starting to become this fad, not something that's going to really change the world. And drugs kind of became a symbol. And my kind of understanding of this is that people used LSD to try to find peace and love, but those ideas of peace and love were projected onto LSD than LSD actually creating the society of peace and love. So it's very interesting to hear him being very critical of psychedelic drug use, and that was very central in the counterculture. But I think the way that he kind of foreshadows how drugs create this dependent society dependent on drugs, is very dangerous. I think that ultimately was an important part of the death of counterculture, where it kind of represents the counterculture burning out, because he describes how it's like you can't sell personal salvation in a capsule. Like, it's not something you can sell to people. So it kind of turns back in on this technocracy idea, how people are trying to use, or people are becoming very dependent on technology, and technology used to control people. And the fact that young people were starting to become very dependent on drugs like LSD to find this consciousness revolution kind of just represents really the counterculture not having really much change, as far as using drugs to change society. And to end this video, I want to talk about something from a completely different book, which I think kind of describes the same thing that he's trying to describe with how psychedelic drugs really were part of the death of counterculture. And in the book Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas by Hunter S. Thompson, which was published in 1971, so a couple years after this book. But in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Thompson writes that what Leary took down with him was a central illusion of a whole lifestyle that he helped to create. A generation of permanent cripples, failed seekers, who never understood the essential old mystic fallacy of the acid culture. The desperate assumption that somebody, or at least some force, is tending that light at the end of the tunnel. So I think a lot of these people in the hippie revolution were very idealistic and very naive. They didn't really have a good understanding of what was going on in the world, and they kind of were seeking this light at the end of the tunnel, this utopia at the end of the tunnel. But once they got there, they realized there really wasn't anything there at all. It was all just kind of an illusion. And I think the death of counterculture, really the moment that counterculture became something that you could write about and put a label on and identify, is the moment that it died and kind of burned itself out. And I think he really foreshadowed the end of counterculture when he published this book. But I think that the counterculture didn't really necessarily die, because the moment that it burned itself out is the moment that it was absorbed by popular culture. And after events like Watergate, I think counterculture really became mainstream, and that kind of replaced the old culture of the 1950s, and the old culture became the new counterculture, which I think Reagan's presidency really highlights that change. Because when Reagan became president, he was trying to, I think, fight against these forces that were the counterculture revolution, and the right kind of became the new counterculture. And we're at a point now in America where I think these two forces are coming into conflict again, where the established order, which was really birthed from the counterculture, is now fighting against the new counterculture, which was the America of the 1950s, which is now people like Donald Trump are this moment where the order that was replaced by the counterculture starting to fight back and starting to try to stop what what began in the 1960s. And this is the moment of conflict where once you get through this era, a brand new culture will be established, like we saw in the 1950s. And as you described in this book before, that when you get this new affluent culture after the crisis, you end up with these discontent youth. And that's what happened in the 1960s. So I think looking at this book now, looking back at it, you see counterculture as this cycle of culture and counterculture just continuously replacing each other. So the counterculture didn't really die out. It just was absorbed by mainstream culture. And that's where we are today. And there are forces today that are trying to fight against that culture that was established after the mid-70s. And yeah, but yeah, a lot of interesting reflections on this book. There's a lot that I disagree with, a lot that I do agree with, but I think this book does a good job at foreshadowing what was to come with how counterculture ended up playing out in 1970s and going forward from 1969. But anyway, I rambled enough there about stuff, but be sure to subscribe and we'll see you in the next video.